If you like this story, please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss the next exciting stories. And now let's enjoy the story. Deshaun Carter had always been a survivor, a brilliant gamer with an unmatched focus. He was known in the virtual world as Xander, the leader of one of the most competitive gaming teams in the country. In his game, Deshaun controlled entire armies, formulated strategies in real time, and commanded respect from players worldwide. But in real life, he was just another young black man trying to make it in a world stacked against him. Deshaun had grown up in the rough neighborhoods of Atlanta, where opportunity was scarce, and the road to success was often blocked by forces beyond his control. With his parents struggling to keep the lights on, Deshaun had honed his skills in gaming to the point where it could have been his ticket out. But for all his talent, he couldn't escape the hard reality of being black in America, where systemic inequality loomed over everything he did. It all began one fateful day when Deshaun was on his way to meet a potential sponsor for his gaming team. A promising breakthrough for someone like him, an opportunity to elevate his career and make a real name for himself. But when he stepped out of his apartment, everything changed. The police were waiting for him. They had an arrest warrant for Deshaun, accusing him of the brutal rape and murder of a 16-year-old girl, Emily Thomas, a case that had shocked the local community. The evidence, they said, was damning. DNA samples, fingerprints, and a testimony from a so-called witness who claimed to have seen Deshaun leave the scene. But Deshaun had never even met Emily. In fact, he had an airtight alibi. He had been streaming his latest gaming session when the crime occurred. Yet, despite his innocence, the police were convinced he was guilty. Deshaun didn't know it at the time, but the accusations were part of a larger plan to frame him. A plan that involved corrupt elements of the justice system and the powerful elites pulling the strings behind the scenes. The media quickly caught wind of the case, sensationalizing it with every update. The story of a promising young black man accused of such a horrific crime captured the public's attention. The court of public opinion had already convicted Deshaun before he even had the chance to defend himself. Inside the courtroom, the prosecutor, a man named Richard Pierce, was relentless. He painted Deshaun as a dangerous, predatory figure, someone who could hide behind the anonymity of the digital world. But there were no facts to back up the charges. The day evidence was questionable, the fingerprint match was weak, and the witness was unreliable, having been paid off by someone with deep pockets. Yet the court didn't care. Deshaun was black, young, and poor, and the justice system wasn't interested in the truth. The corrupt prosecutor, in collaboration with a high-powered defense attorney on the payroll of local elites, ensured that the verdict would be swift and unyielding. With a broken heart and no hope for justice, Deshaun was sentenced to life in prison. The system had failed him. The very same system that was supposed to protect him had turned its back on him. And just like that, Deshaun Carter, a young man with dreams and talent, became another statistic. But Deshaun wasn't the kind of person to give up easily. Deshaun's first days inside the Fulton County Jail were nothing like what he had seen on TV or read about in books. He had been sentenced to life for a crime he didn't commit, thrown into a system that seemed to thrive on keeping men like him down. The harsh reality of life behind bars set in immediately as he was herded into a crowded, cold cell block. The sounds of clanging metal doors, shouting inmates, and the smell of sweat and stale air made him feel like he was in another world, a world that didn't care about the truth, only survival. The guards treated him like any other criminal. No questions asked, no second chances. They didn't care about his innocence or the fact that he was a skilled gamer with dreams of a different life. They didn't care about his mother, who had fought tirelessly to ensure he had a future, or the countless friends and mentors who had encouraged him to aim higher. To the officers and the other inmates, he was just another young black man thrown into the system. And the system didn't care about him. In his first week, Deshaun learned quickly that he wasn't just fighting for his freedom, but for his life. He was assigned to a cell with a man named Marcus, a towering figure with a violent history. It didn't take long before Marcus tried to test Deshaun, offering him a deal to survive the prison's harsh environment. Deshaun could either pay protection to Marcus, or he could face the wrath of every inmate in the block. This was the reality of prison. Survival depended on who you knew, how much power you could wield, and how quickly you could make a name for yourself. But Deshaun wasn't about to play the game the way they wanted him to. His mind was sharp, and his determination to clear his name was stronger than any threat they could throw at him. One night, when Marcus tried to get Deshaun to sign over a portion of his prison wages in exchange for safety, Deshaun made his move. He wasn't a fighter by nature, but he had learned enough from his time on the streets to know when to stand his ground. As Marcus tried to corner him, Deshaun used every ounce of his strength and wit to disable the larger man, putting him in a hold that forced Marcus to back off. It was a risky move, but Deshaun had no choice. If he didn't stand up to the brutality, he would be crushed. The other inmates watched in silence, and word spread fast about Deshaun's refusal to bend. He wasn't a man to be trifled with, even in a place where power was everything. But while his victory in that moment solidified his position within the prison walls, it also made him a target. Not only did the corrupt officers keep a closer eye on him, but Marcus's associates in the prison gang now saw him as a threat to their dominance. Deshaun was trapped in a game of survival where the rules were written in blood and power, and the system did nothing but reinforce the oppression. But as difficult as it was to survive inside the prison, Deshaun never lost sight of his larger mission, proving his innocence. His mother, ever the unwavering believer in his integrity, would send him letters, reminding him that she knew the truth and that they would fight this together. It gave him the strength to hold on, to keep pushing for justice even when it felt like the whole world had turned its back on him. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. In prison, time lost its meaning. But Deshaun kept his mind sharp, using his skills from the virtual world to strategize and observe the patterns around him. He began to notice strange things about his case, things that didn't add up. The evidence was weak, but it was also too neatly packaged. It was almost as if someone had orchestrated it, ensuring that everything pointed directly to him. Then, one day, a break came. Deshaun had made a habit of talking to anyone who would listen, using his charm and wit to gain allies among the few decent people left in the system. He met an inmate named Gerald, an older man who had been incarcerated for a decade for a crime he didn't commit. Gerald had become something of a mentor to Deshaun, showing him the ropes of prison life and offering advice on how to navigate the corrupt system. One day during a routine conversation, Gerald dropped a bombshell. "You know," Gerald said, leaning in close, "this whole thing smells like a setup. I've seen it before. They do it to men like you all the time. Young, black, with no family to speak of. They just make it easy. Framing's a damn art form in this place." Deshaun's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? How do you know?" "Because I was in the same boat. The system's all rigged, and I know how it works. What they did to you, it wasn't just an accident. Someone wanted you behind bars, and they made sure you stayed there." Deshaun couldn't shake the feeling that Gerald was right. Everything about his case had been too convenient. The supposed witness, the evidence that didn't match the way the police had treated him from the moment they arrested him, it all pointed to something deeper. He wasn't just being framed by a random person. Someone with power, someone untouchable, had orchestrated this. Now Deshaun had a new mission. If he was going to survive this nightmare, he had to figure out who was pulling the strings. He began to search for clues, digging into the records of his case and using his contacts to gather any information he could find. And in doing so, he stumbled upon something that would change everything. A name, Richard Pierce. Richard Pierce was the prosecutor who had orchestrated the charges against him. Pierce had a reputation in the legal community, known for closing cases quickly and efficiently, often bending the law to his will. Deshaun quickly realized that Pierce had connections to the highest levels of power, and that his rise in the legal world had been facilitated by his ability to silence the truth and bury the innocent. But Pierce wasn't just a corrupt prosecutor. He was part of a much larger network, a network that had used Deshaun as a pawn to cover up something far more sinister. And now Deshaun was determined to uncover it, no matter what the cost. Deshaun spent the next few weeks quietly gathering information, carefully avoiding suspicion while he sought out answers. He was living in a pressure cooker, his every move watched by both the corrupt guards and the dangerous inmates. But his resolve was unwavering. His mission was bigger than survival. It was about clearing his name and exposing the truth behind the conspiracy that had torn his life apart. In prison, information was currency. The key to survival was not just physical strength, but also the ability to manipulate the system, to use the right connections, and to know who to trust. Deshaun had learned early on that the most dangerous thing you could do in prison was act like you were an outsider. So he began to align himself with the right people, including Gerald, who had been more than just a mentor. Gerald had connections on the outside, a network of people who could help uncover the corruption, and he had seen how the powerful could manipulate the system from within. But Deshaun couldn't just sit back and wait. He had to act, and he had to act fast. Every day he spent in prison, he could feel the walls closing in on him. His time was running out. He had to find out who was behind the framing, and he had to do it before Pierce or anyone else made sure he was silenced for good. One evening, Deshaun received a letter from his mother, as she did every week. Her words were simple but filled with love and support, but this time there was something else in her letter, a hint of something more. "I've been digging into your case, Deshaun. I have a feeling that someone with a lot of power is behind this. I've been reaching out to some contacts from your old life, people who knew you before all this happened. I don't know if they'll be able to help, but I'm trying. Don't lose hope. I believe in you, son. We'll find the truth. I'll make sure of it." Her words gave him the courage to continue, even when everything seemed hopeless. Deshaun began looking deeper into the prosecutor, Richard Pierce. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that Pierce was more than just a corrupt prosecutor. He was a cog in a much larger machine, a system built on power, greed, and manipulation. Deshaun's investigation into Pierce's background revealed disturbing connections to some of the wealthiest and most influential people in the city. It wasn't just a matter of a botched case. It was about money laundering, political cover-ups, and corporate greed. Pierce had a track record of manipulating cases, bending the law for those who could afford it, and destroying the lives of those who got in his way. But Deshaun knew that uncovering this was only part of the battle. He needed evidence, concrete, irrefutable proof that Pierce and others like him were involved in the corruption. Without it, he would never be able to take down the system. His mission had shifted. It wasn't just about clearing his name anymore. It was about taking down a network of corruption that ran deep, a network that included law enforcement, the legal system, and even the media. The next step in his plan was risky. Deshaun knew he couldn't do this alone, so he turned to the only people he could trust, Gerald and a few select inmates who had the skills he needed. He managed to get access to the prison's meager computer system, and with Gerald's help, he began to dig into the public records of the people who had been involved in his case. Every piece of information Deshaun uncovered pointed to a trail that led back to one name, Lynn Matthews. Matthews was a high-profile lawyer with deep ties to Pierce and the city's most influential figures. Her reputation was spotless in public, but behind closed doors, she was known to be a fixer, someone who cleaned up messes for those who could afford her services. Deshaun didn't know the full extent of her involvement, but he knew she was key to understanding the conspiracy against him. But how could he get close to her without drawing suspicion? Deshaun needed leverage, something that would allow him to confront Matthews directly. He had no intention of making the same mistakes the corrupt officers had made in his case. He would not simply stand by and wait for justice to come to him. He would go after it. Deshaun turned to his old life for help. His expertise in the virtual world, his skills as a gamer, were not just limited to online battles. He had learned to navigate digital landscapes, to find holes in security systems, to exploit weaknesses. With Gerald's help, Deshaun began hacking into Matthews's professional accounts, tracing her dealings with Pierce and others. It was dangerous, but every risk was worth it. Meanwhile, the corruption within the prison itself began to surface. Deshaun overheard a conversation between two guards who were discussing his case. They spoke in hushed tones, but Deshaun's ears caught every word. The guards had been paid to keep him in line, to make sure he never got out of prison alive. There were whispers of more than just a fabricated case. There was talk of orchestrating an accident, something that would look like a natural death. Deshaun shivered at the thought. It was clear now. The system wanted him dead. That night, as Deshaun lay awake in his cell, he made a vow to himself. He wasn't going to die in this place. He would expose every corrupt official, every false accusation, every powerful individual who thought they could get away with murder. And he would do it all from within the walls of the very prison that had tried to break him. Deshawn's investigation was beginning to gain momentum, but the road ahead was perilous. Each day in prison was a battle, not just for survival, but for the future of his freedom. The walls seemed to close in tighter as the guards, led by the corrupt Captain Thomas Riley, made life increasingly difficult for him. Riley had long been on Pierce's payroll, and he was doing everything in his power to ensure Deshawn remained behind bars. Despite the mounting pressure, Deshawn kept pushing forward. His digital investigation into Lynn Matthews and Richard Pierce was starting to yield results, but he needed more. More information, more allies, and more courage. It was during one of his routine visits to the prison's exercise yard that Deshawn found the ally he'd been searching for, but not in the place he expected. He was leaning against the stone wall of the yard, waiting for the hour to pass when he spotted someone familiar. His heart skipped a beat. Aaron Ace Delgado, a former lawyer-turned-inmate who had been convicted of a white-collar crime that had ruined his life, was standing at the far side of the yard. Ace was known for his brilliant mind and legal skills, but in prison he was just another convicted felon. Deshawn had seen him a few times around the yard, but they had never spoken. In fact, most inmates tried to stay away from him because of his ability to manipulate the system. But today, Deshawn was desperate. He needed help, and Ace might be the one person who could get him closer to the truth. Deshawn approached cautiously, knowing that any wrong move could draw unwanted attention. He had no idea where Ace's loyalty stood, but he knew one thing. Ace had the knowledge that could break open his case. "Hey, Ace," Deshawn said, keeping his voice steady. Ace turned, his face unreadable. "What do you want, new guy?" he asked, a hint of bitterness in his tone. "I know who you are," Deshawn replied, trying to make his voice sound confident. "You're the one who used to work for Matthews, right?" Ace's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Deshawn thought he had made a mistake. But then Ace's expression softened slightly, and he nodded. "Yeah, I used to," he muttered. "But I'm not getting involved with anyone anymore. You know how that goes, right?" Deshawn hesitated, but then pressed on. "I'm not asking you to get involved. I just need information. I've been framed, Ace. They've got me in here for something I didn't do. And I think I know who's behind it." Ace looked around, making sure no one was listening. He motioned for Deshawn to follow him to a quieter corner of the yard, out of sight of the guards. "You don't know what you're dealing with, kid. Matthews is untouchable. She's got connections everywhere. Judges, prosecutors, cops, the works." Deshawn swallowed his frustration. "I know that. I've got proof. But I need you to help me get it out. I can't do it alone." Ace studied him for a moment, as if weighing his options. Finally, he spoke. "What's in it for me?" Deshawn took a deep breath. "I'm not offering you anything, but I can get you out of here. If I'm right about this, there's enough dirt on Matthews and Pierce to bring them both down. If we bring them down, it's not just me that gets freed. It's a whole system that's been screwing people like us for years." Ace seemed to consider this, then nodded slowly. "I've been waiting for someone like you to show up. Fine, I'll help you, but don't expect it to be easy. You'll need to be smart about this." Deshawn smiled, feeling the weight of hope settle into his chest. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he might have a chance at freedom. But the battle ahead wouldn't be easy. Matthews and Pierce were too powerful to take down with just a few pieces of information. They would need to gather all the evidence they could, and they would need to expose the entire network of corruption that protected these elites. For the next few days, Deshawn and Ace worked in secret. Deshawn fed Ace the information he had gathered on Matthews and Pierce, and Ace, using his legal expertise, began helping Deshawn organize the data. Ace also reached out to his old contacts on the outside, making sure the information was safe. Every move had to be calculated, every word weighed carefully. But they were being watched. Every moment, every conversation, every glance was scrutinized by the prison guards. Captain Riley, sensing that something was wrong, started making life even more difficult for Deshawn, sending him to solitary confinement on false charges of insubordination. It was a warning. A warning that would only drive Deshawn further toward his goal. Inside the cold, empty walls of solitary confinement, Deshaun didn't break. Instead, he used the time to think, to plan. He knew that the only way to bring down Matthews and Pierce was to get the truth out, no matter what it took. Meanwhile, Ace continued to work on the outside, using his connections to find more evidence. He knew that Deshaun needed more than just a few pieces of circumstantial evidence. He needed something big, something that would bring the full weight of the law down on the criminals who had framed him. Finally, after weeks of working in the shadows, Ace came through. He managed to get his hands on an encrypted file, an email chain between Matthews and Pierce that contained damning evidence of their illegal dealings. The file included communications about Deshaun's case, proving that Pierce had knowingly used fabricated evidence to secure Deshaun's conviction. It also included evidence of payments from high-profile clients in exchange for corrupt deals and the framing of innocent men and women like Deshaun. But they couldn't just sit back and celebrate. This evidence was too valuable. If Matthews and Pierce found out they had it, they would stop at nothing to destroy it and silence anyone who stood in their way. The plan was set. They needed to get the evidence to the right people. Deshaun couldn't do it from inside the prison walls, but with Ace's help, they had a chance to expose the truth. It wouldn't be easy. It might even cost them their lives. But Deshaun was ready to fight with everything he had, and for the first time in years, he wasn't fighting just for himself. He was fighting for justice. The days stretched on for Deshaun, each one dragging by slower than the last. His mind never left the pursuit of justice, but as the weeks passed, it became clear just how risky their plan had become. With Ace's help, they had secured irrefutable evidence that could expose the truth behind the conspiracy. But the danger of being caught, of Matthews and Pierce discovering their moves, was higher than ever. Inside the walls of the prison, Deshaun's situation was becoming increasingly volatile. Captain Riley had taken a personal interest in making his life miserable. He had subjected Deshaun to more solitary confinement stints and had placed him under constant surveillance, hoping to break him into submission. But Deshaun's resolve only strengthened in response. Every extra hour in solitary was a reminder of what was at stake, not just his own freedom, but the chance to bring down the entire corrupt system that had destroyed his life. But it wasn't just the guards Deshaun had to worry about. There was a network of informants, inmates who were bribed or threatened into watching his every move. Deshaun couldn't trust anyone inside the prison walls except for Ace. And while Ace had been a beacon of hope, even his help couldn't fully shield Deshaun from the risks. Ace, knowing that the time was running out, had orchestrated an elaborate plan to get the evidence out of the prison. He had made contact with several key figures on the outside, including a few high-ranking members of the press and law enforcement who were sympathetic to Deshaun's case. But none of it would matter if Deshaun couldn't get the evidence into the right hands, and that was where the escape plan came in. It was risky, almost foolhardy, but Deshaun had no other choice. He had to take the fight to Matthews and Pierce directly. In the dead of night, Ace orchestrated the most daring prison break attempt in the facility's history. A plan was set in motion. The night was their only chance to escape unnoticed. With the help of a trusted inmate who had been working with Ace on the outside, the plan started to unfold. The prison walls, thick with years of decay, were now the backdrop to the most dangerous game of Deshaun's life. They had to move quickly, and every minute they spent in the yard or corridor put them closer to being caught. But the small window of opportunity had arrived. Ace had managed to secure a series of security footage loops, footage that showed the cameras going offline at critical moments. He had also arranged for several outside contacts to take part in the operation, ensuring there would be a place for Deshaun to hide once he was out of the prison. But things didn't go exactly as planned. The moment Deshaun made his move, he felt the weight of every guard's eyes on him. They had planned for a quiet getaway, a slip through the cracks, but the guards weren't as naive as they had hoped. Just as Deshaun reached the fence that marked the boundary of the prison yard, a loud alarm blared throughout the facility. The sound of boots slamming against the concrete floor echoed behind him. "Get down!" a voice shouted, followed by a barrage of gunfire aimed above his head. Deshaun hit the ground, the dirt of the yard flying up around him as the world seemed to slow down. He crawled towards the nearest exit, his heart racing in his chest. Ace's plan had only partially worked. Now it was up to Deshaun to get out on his own. With every step, the world seemed to grow heavier. The sounds of guards shouting, of the prison doors opening and closing, of desperate voices calling out were drowned out by the blood pounding in his ears. But Deshaun pushed on, every muscle screaming for him to stop. But his spirit, his desire for justice, refused to give in. The fence loomed ahead. With one last burst of strength, Deshaun reached it. His fingers clutched the wire, his body heaving as he forced himself up and over. Just as he made the leap, a shot rang out. A bullet grazed his leg, sending a shockwave of pain through his body. He landed heavily on the other side, the impact almost knocking the breath out of him. But Deshaun kept moving, his body screaming in pain, but his mind focused on only one thing: freedom. As Deshaun ran through the woods behind the prison, his heart hammered in his chest. His escape was only half successful. He was still in the heart of enemy territory, and Pierce and Matthews weren't going to let him slip away so easily. But his chance of survival was growing with every step, and he was more determined than ever to get the evidence into the hands of those who could use it to take down the corrupt system that had kept him locked up for so long. The night was their ally now. Deshaun's legs burned as he pushed forward through the dense underbrush, the sounds of the prison alarms still echoing in his ears. The air was thick with the tension of being hunted, and every step he took felt like a countdown to being caught. The cut on his leg throbbed, but he could feel the surge of adrenaline overriding the pain. He couldn't stop now. There was too much at stake. He had to make it out of this alive and get the evidence to the right people. His mind raced through the events of the past few weeks, how he had come so close to uncovering the truth behind the corruption. The evidence Ace had managed to gather, the damning files about Pierce and Matthews, were his ticket to freedom. But it was also the key to taking down the entire corrupt system that had imprisoned so many innocents like him. The real fight had only just begun. Ahead, Deshaun saw the dim outline of a safe house that Ace had arranged for him. It was a secluded cabin in the woods, far from the reach of the corrupt officers who would be looking for him. But there was no time to rest. He had to keep moving. Suddenly, the sound of a helicopter hummed in the distance. The search was already underway. They wouldn't stop until they found him. He could hear the crackle of walkie-talkies and distant sirens in the distance. The authorities were closing in. Deshaun didn't hesitate. He kept moving, his mind focused on the task at hand. His life and the lives of others who had been wronged depended on him getting this information out into the open. The system wasn't going to take down its own people, but he could. With Ace's help and the hacker, Harry, they could expose the truth. But they had to act fast. Hours passed as Deshaun made his way to the safe house. He arrived at the cabin, out of breath, his body covered in sweat and dirt. He forced the door open and slipped inside, his heart pounding. He scanned the interior quickly, checking for any signs that anyone had been there. The place was empty, just as it should be. He collapsed onto the couch, his leg aching, his chest heaving with exhaustion. But there was no time to rest. He had to get the information to the press, to someone who could help him take down the real criminals. His mind was sharp, despite the physical toll his body had taken. He could hear Ace's voice in his head, urging him to stay focused, to not let the fear take over. Suddenly, the sound of a phone ringing broke the silence. Deshaun scrambled to his feet, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon, but then he saw the number on the screen. It was Ace. "Deshaun, we've got a problem." Ace's voice came through the phone, sharp and urgent. "What's going on?" Deshaun asked, sitting down, his heart racing. "They've found your location. Matthews and Pierce have already sent a team out. They know you've escaped, and they're coming for you. You need to move, now." Deshaun's blood ran cold. He'd known it was only a matter of time before they caught up with him. But hearing Ace confirm it made it feel too real. He had to act quickly. He couldn't let them catch him, not when he was so close to exposing the truth. "How much time do I have?" Deshaun asked. "Maybe 20 minutes if you're lucky," Ace replied. "The chopper's already been dispatched, and the ground team isn't far behind. But I've got a way out for you. Head to the south. There's a safe route that leads out of the county. I've set it up." Deshaun didn't hesitate. He grabbed the evidence, the files Ace had gathered, and shoved them into his bag. He checked his phone, sending a quick message to Harry, who was on standby, waiting to hack into Pierce's network. It was their best chance to get the information out, but they needed to stay one step ahead of the law. "Thanks, Ace," Deshaun said, his voice tight with urgency. "I'm on my way." Deshaun grabbed his gun and headed out of the cabin. The sun had set, and the darkness was both his ally and his enemy. He moved quickly, slipping through the trees and making his way toward the south. The night was quiet except for the distant sound of the helicopter, growing louder as it neared. His heart raced in his chest, each footstep a reminder that every second counted. He could feel the weight of the evidence in his bag, the burden of the truth pressing on him. If he didn't get it out now, everything he had gone through, his escape, his fight for justice, would be for nothing. As Deshaun pushed forward, his mind focused on the mission ahead. He heard the rustling of leaves behind him. He turned, instinctively reaching for his gun, but when he saw the figure emerging from the shadows, his heart skipped a beat. It was Ace. "What the hell are you doing here?" Deshaun demanded, lowering his weapon. "Just making sure you don't get yourself killed," Ace replied with a grin. "You think I'd let you go through this alone?" Deshaun didn't have time to argue. They had to move, and they had to move fast. Together, they ran through the forest, using the cover of night to evade the law. As they neared the edge of the woods, Deshaun's phone buzzed again. It was Harry. "I've got the files," Harry's voice came through, muffled by static. "The hack is done. The evidence is going public." Deshaun's heart surged with hope. "Good work, Harry. I'll be in touch when I'm clear." Ace and Deshaun reached the edge of the forest, where a waiting car was parked. Ace had arranged for a driver to take them to the next safe house, where they could regroup and plan their next move. The driver, a man named Marcus, was waiting for them. "Let's go," Ace said, opening the door. Deshaun climbed into the back seat, his mind racing with the weight of everything that had happened. The evidence was out, but they weren't safe yet. Matthews and Pierce would stop at nothing to protect themselves, and Deshaun knew they would be coming for him. He couldn't let his guard down, not for a second. As the car sped through the night, Deshaun stared out the window, his thoughts filled with the next step. He had come this far, and there was no turning back now. The fight for justice was just beginning. The night seemed endless, and Deshaun could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. He sat in the back of the car, Ace next to him, and Marcus driving at breakneck speed through the winding back roads of the county. The world outside the windows was a blur of shadows, the occasional flicker of a distant streetlight illuminating their path. The evidence had been released to the press, but with it came the realization that Matthews and Pierce would stop at nothing to silence him. They had powerful allies, resources, and a deep network of corruption to shield them. "We can't trust anyone," Deshaun muttered, his mind whirling. "Not even the press. Not now." Ace looked at him, a grim smile on his face. "You're right. This isn't about exposing them to the public anymore. It's about survival and taking them down from the inside." Deshaun nodded, feeling the truth of it settle deep in his chest. Matthews and Pierce had corrupted everything, the legal system, the police force, even the media. If they wanted to end him, they'd make sure it looked like an accident. They were ruthless, and there was no telling how far they would go. The car's tires screeched as Marcus took a sharp turn, veering off the main road and into a hidden gravel lot. A small, nondescript building stood at the end of the lot, surrounded by tall, overgrown trees. It was a safe house of sorts, but this time, there was no guarantee they would be safe for long. "We've got to get inside," Ace said, looking over his shoulder. "We don't have much time before they realize where we're headed." Deshaun opened the door and stepped out, feeling his muscles stiffen from hours of tension and travel. He looked up at the building, an old, run-down office building that had once been a contractor's garden. It had been unoccupied for years, but now it was their temporary refuge. The three of them made their way to the door, staying low and moving quickly. Deshaun could feel the cold night air biting at his skin, the stillness of the moment heavy with the danger lurking just around the corner. They were being watched. He knew it. Inside, they made their way to the basement, a room filled with computers and encrypted files. Harry had set up a secure network, and the plan was simple: hack into the system, uncover Pierce and Matthews' hidden operations, and make sure it went public. But even as Deshaun sat at the terminal, his fingers hovering over the keys, he could feel the storm gathering outside. "We've got one shot at this," Ace said, his voice steady but tense. "If we don't do this now, they'll get to us first." Deshaun nodded, pressing the keys to bring up the encrypted files. Harry's voice crackled over the speaker, telling them that the system was ready to be breached. But just as Deshaun began the final sequence, a sudden noise echoed through the basement. His heart skipped a beat, and he exchanged a glance with Ace. They weren't alone. The door to the basement swung open and a group of armed men stormed in. Deshaun's heart hammered in his chest as he recognized the men in the doorway. Matthews' private security team. They'd found them. "You're not getting out of here," one of the men snarled, raising his gun. Deshaun's instincts kicked in, and he ducked behind the desk, pulling Ace to the ground with him. Bullets whizzed past, narrowly missing them as they scrambled for cover. "We've got to move," Ace shouted, his voice filled with urgency. Deshaun didn't need to be told twice. He pulled his gun from the holster and aimed at the door. But just as he prepared to fire, the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. The cavalry was coming. The FBI. This time they were on their side. "Get ready," Ace said, his eyes narrowing. "It's now or never." The door burst open again, and a group of FBI agents, led by Special Agent Harris, stormed in, guns raised. "Hands up, FBI," Harris shouted, his voice commanding. Deshaun didn't hesitate. He lowered his gun, recognizing that this was his chance to finally take down Matthews and Pierce. Harris's team swarmed the room, securing the area and taking the security team into custody. It was over, or so they thought. The moment the agents had secured the men, Deshaun turned to Harris, a cold fury in his eyes. "You've got to listen to me," Deshaun said. "This is just the beginning. Matthews and Pierce are still out there. They're protected. They've got too many connections. You have to go after them. You can't stop now." Harris, his face hardening, met Deshaun's gaze. "We'll get them, but we need your help. We need everything you've got." Deshaun nodded, the weight of it all pressing down on him. He knew the fight wasn't over. There were still more corrupt officials, more hidden secrets, and more lives to be ruined by the elites who thought they could get away with murder. As the FBI agents worked to secure the premises, Deshaun sat back in his chair, exhaustion washing over him. The battle was far from won, but for the first time in what felt like forever, he had hope. The truth was out, and the system was beginning to crack. Matthews and Pierce couldn't hide forever. The fight for justice had only just begun, and already Deshaun felt the toll of it all. Though Matthews and Pierce were temporarily on the defensive, Deshaun knew they weren't going to sit idly by while their empire crumbled. They had too much to lose. Their connections in high places, police, government, business, were vast, and the resources at their disposal were nearly limitless. The FBI may have been a powerful ally, but the road to exposing their corruption would be going hard and fraught with danger. Deshaun stood in front of the small mirror in the safe house, fixing his tie, his reflection betraying his exhaustion. His face was marked by the sleepless nights and the weight of everything that had happened in such a short time. His phone buzzed on the table in front of him, and he glanced at it. A message from Ace. "FBI got the docs. We're making progress, but they're coming for us." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. The team had only a few days before Matthews and Pierce mobilized again, and they needed to act fast. He couldn't sit back anymore. He had to take the fight to them, bring it straight to their doorstep. "We have to move now," Deshaun said to Marcus, who had been silently watching him from the corner of the room. Marcus nodded, his face grim. "I'll make the call." Deshaun turned to Ace, who was still at the computer, working tirelessly to crack the final layers of security on the encrypted data that the FBI had uncovered. His fingers flew over the keyboard as if the weight of the world wasn't pressing down on him. "We're getting closer," Ace said, not looking up. "If we can access the rest of these files, we'll have everything we need to take them down for good. But we need to stay ahead of them." Deshaun agreed, but there was no denying the danger they were in. Matthews' men would stop at nothing to protect their empire, and Pierce was already plotting his next move. Their resources were deep, and they'd already demonstrated they were willing to resort to violence. The world didn't care about Deshaun. He was just another poor kid from the wrong side of the tracks. But that didn't matter now. He had come too far to turn back. "We've got no choice but to keep pushing forward," Deshaun said, the resolve in his voice as hard as steel. Hours later, Deshaun and his team found themselves in a high-rise office building in the heart of the city. This was Matthews's playground, the hub of his operations. The stakes couldn't be higher, and Deshaun could feel the weight of his decision in every step he took as they made their way up the elevator. "This is it," Marcus said, his voice tense as the doors to the elevator opened. "We get in, get the files, and get out." They moved through the darkened hallway, the air thick with the tension of what was about to unfold. The building was eerily silent, with only the sound of their footsteps echoing off the walls. At the far end of the hall, the door to Matthew's office was slightly ajar. Deshaun motioned for the team to move in. Inside, they found what they were looking for: files, a treasure trove of information, everything they needed to expose Matthews and Pierce. From the illegal wire transfers to the bribes, the evidence was damning. But they weren't alone for long. Just as Deshaun grabbed the files, the sound of boots pounding down the hallway reached his ears. Matthews' men had arrived. They were closing in. "Get to the car," Deshaun ordered, his voice urgent. The team rushed for the exit, but it was too late. The hallway was swarming with armed men. The doors to the stairwell were locked, and there was nowhere to go but forward. "We're not getting out this way," Ace said, his voice clipped with panic. Deshaun knew they had only one chance left. "We fight." The team spread out, positioning themselves to take on the threat head-on. Deshaun's heart was pounding in his chest, adrenaline flooding his system. He wasn't just fighting for his life now. He was fighting for the truth, for the lives of the innocent victims Matthews and Pierce had trampled over. It was time to take a stand. Gunfire rang out, and Deshaun ducked behind the nearest desk, his hands shaking but steady as he fired back. The fight was fierce, chaotic, and the odds were stacked against them. But they fought with everything they had. They couldn't let Matthews and Pierce win, not after everything they'd been through. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance. It wasn't the cavalry coming for them, and it was Matthews's final attempt to cover his tracks. The police had been tipped off, but this time it wouldn't be enough to save him. "Let's finish this," Deshaun growled, eyes locked on Matthews' men. Back on the streets, the FBI, led by Agent Harris, moved in to surround the building. They had everything they needed to arrest Matthews, Pierce, and everyone involved in the conspiracy. It wasn't just about exposing the corruption. It was about ending it, once and for all. Deshaun and his team made their way to a hidden exit, narrowly escaping the chaos they had left behind. But they knew that the real battle wasn't over. They had exposed the truth, but Matthews and Pierce were still out there, still dangerous. And the fight for justice was just beginning. As Deshaun and his team walked into the night, the sound of the sirens faded, but the realization of what they had done lingered in the air. They had fought against a broken system, a corrupt legal system, in a world that had written them off. But they had fought back, and they had won. The world would never be the same. For Deshaun, this victory wasn't just about clearing his name. It was about proving that no matter how corrupt the system was, no matter how much power the elites had, the truth could still win. They could silence his voice for a while, but in the end, it would always rise again. Deshaun knew one thing for certain: this wasn't the end of the battle. It was just the beginning. He would fight, not just for himself, but for every person who had been wronged, for every voice that had been silenced by the powerful, for every life that had been taken in the name of injustice. And when the next fight came, he would be ready. The night after the escape, Deshaun sat alone in a small apartment that had once belonged to a friend who had long since moved away. He didn't know what his next steps were, but he knew they had won a significant battle. They had exposed the first layer of corruption, and that was no small feat. But there was more to the story, so much more. His mind raced. He thought about Matthews and Pierce, about all the powerful figures who had orchestrated the crimes that had led to his wrongful imprisonment. How many other lives had they ruined? How many others had they silenced? And most importantly, who else was involved? The files they had taken from Matthews' office were more than just the key to exposing them. They were the key to understanding the full scope of the conspiracy. But the deeper they dug, the more dangerous it became. They had already crossed a line. They were no longer just fighting for justice. They were fighting for their lives. Deshaun's phone buzzed again. It was a message from Ace. We're close. Found something big. Deshaun exhaled sharply, glancing around the apartment. He couldn't afford to stay here long. Matthew's men would be looking for him. Every move he made had to be calculated, precise. One mistake could cost him everything. Hours later, Deshaun met Ace and Marcus in an undisclosed location, a small, dingy coffee shop on the outskirts of town. Ace was already there, his eyes scanning the room nervously. "You found something?" Deshaun asked, sitting down across from him. Ace handed him a folder thick with papers. "This is what we've been waiting for," he said. "It's all right here." Deshaun flipped through the pages, his heart sinking with each revelation. They had suspected Matthews and Pierce were only the tip of the iceberg. But this was bigger than he had imagined. There were names, connections, people in the highest echelons of power, all linked to the corruption. "This isn't just about us anymore," Deshaun said, his voice low and grim. "This goes all the way to the top." Marcus leaned forward, his face hardening. "Who's pulling the strings?" Deshaun didn't need to look at the papers again to know. He had recognized the name immediately. "Councilman Thomas Hayes," he said, his voice cold. "He's been using Matthews and Pierce as his puppets." Councilman Hayes. It made sense now, the shady deals, the bribed officials, the false charges. Deshaun had heard the name before, but it had always seemed too far removed from the people who had been directly involved in his case. Hayes wasn't just any politician. He had connections everywhere, with people who could make anyone disappear without a trace. "What do we do now?" Ace asked. Deshaun stood up, staring at the papers in his hand. "We take him down." The next few days were a blur of planning, hacking, and gathering evidence. They needed more than just papers. They needed hard proof that would bring Hayes to his knees. Deshaun's team had already faced their share of danger, but this felt different. This time they weren't just going after a few corrupt individuals. They were taking on the system itself. They started by digging into Hayes's financials. Ace had gotten into some of the public records, and what they found was chilling. Over the years, Hayes had been using his position to funnel millions of dollars through various shell companies. The money wasn't just being used to bribe police officers or city officials. It was being used to control entire neighborhoods, to fund criminal operations, and to ensure that people like Deshaun stayed in jail, where they could never threaten the system. But there was more. Much more. Deshaun's phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from Agent Harris. "Deshaun, I've got news," she said, her voice urgent. "We've traced the money back to one of Hayes's properties. We need you to meet us there now. It's time to bring this to an end." Deshaun nodded, already on his way. He could feel the weight of the moment. This was it, the final push. When Deshaun arrived at the property, the FBI had already set up shop. They were preparing to raid the building, but there was a problem. The building was heavily guarded by private security, people paid by Hayes to protect his interest. "We're going in no matter what," Agent Harris said, determination in her eyes. "We've got the evidence. We just need to bring it all crashing down." Deshaun stood beside her, his hand on the gun at his side. It had been a long time since he had been this ready for a fight. "Let's do this." The raid was swift and brutal. The security guards didn't know what hit them. Within minutes, the FBI had secured the building, and Deshaun and his team moved in. They found the evidence they needed: Hayes's personal accounts, communications, and the final piece of the puzzle that connected him directly to the corruption, the bribery, and the false charges that had led to Deshaun's wrongful conviction. But Hayes wasn't there. He had already run. Deshaun clenched his fists. "We're not done yet," he said, his voice tight with rage. For the next several days, they hunted Hayes, tracking him through his network of allies. He had tried to lay low, but the walls were closing in. Deshaun was determined to make him pay for what he had done. The lives he had ruined, the pain he had caused, it wasn't going to be forgotten. And then, just when they thought they were out of options, they found him. Hayes was holed up in a luxury penthouse downtown, guarded by hired guns. The FBI was prepared for a standoff, but Deshaun knew they couldn't afford to wait any longer. He led the charge, his heart pounding in his chest as they stormed the penthouse. The confrontation with Hayes was swift and intense. There were no words, only action. Deshaun's team fought their way through the penthouse, finally cornering Hayes in a lavish office overlooking the city. He was furious, cornered, but Deshaun could see the fear in his eyes. He knew the game was up. Your time is over, Deshaun said, his voice steady. You're done. Hayes smirked, but it was hollow. You think you've won? You're just a pawn in a game that's bigger than you. Deshaun's eyes narrowed. You should have thought about that before you decided to destroy people's lives. In the end, Deshaun had everything he needed to bring Hayes down. The corrupt councilman was arrested and charged with a laundry list of crimes: bribery, conspiracy, illegal wiretapping, and a dozen other charges that would keep him in prison for the rest of his life. Deshaun stood on the steps of the courthouse, looking out at the city. It wasn't over, but they had won. They had brought the truth to light. They had taken down the corrupt system that had tried to destroy them. And they had proven that even when the odds were stacked against them, justice could prevail. The battle had been long and hard, but Deshaun knew one thing for sure. It was worth it. No matter the cost, he had fought for what was right. And in the end, the truth had won. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please support me by clicking the logo in the bottom right corner to subscribe to my channel. This way, you won't miss any of the exciting stories coming up. Thank you so much.